Hello. Welcome, everybody, to the Book on Fire. This is going to be our last episode on the dawn of everything, we think. This is the plan. The plan, anyway, is for this to be the last. We're excited about this one. We're going to try and, step back and take a broader view of the book as a whole. Because, we've been really taking one chapter at a time, reading the book really closely, asking a lot of, detailed questions about arguments that they propose and the examples that they bring in, and just kind of responding to everything because the book is so full. And now, after we've read the conclusion, we have an opportunity to kind of really just think about the impact of the book as a whole and the project of the book as a whole. So that's what we're here to do. And we thought it would be really nice to involve another voice in the conversation. And so we have invited our friend Nick onto the podcast. Hi, Nick.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah. Jan and I had met Nick a few years ago, but we didn't know that Nick was a big fan of David Graeber until we read a piece that he wrote a couple of years ago on, what was it called? Closing Paradise's Gates?
Yeah,
Closing Paradise's Gates. And that piece, which we'll link to it in the show notes, it was published on Ill Will, or at least that's where I read it. It's a really great piece that is about bringing together the dawn of everything with the Theses on the Philosophy of History by Walter Benjamin, which is kind of a classic text of its own right, and bringing these two texts into conversation with one another. So especially if you are a Walter Benjamin head or really interested in his material, then this is the piece for you. If you've been interested in the dawn of everything as well, go check it out. I mean, I really...
we reread it recently, and I was just going to say that I was grateful to read it after the first time we read the book, and then after this couple of years of spending time with the book in depth, and it was really interesting to come back to it after that. So yeah,
that's definitely true. Yeah. It was kind of like reading a whole different essay in a certain way. But yeah, I love the Theses on Philosophy of History by Walter Benjamin too. So it was right up my alley. I was right in that Venn diagram of the people most likely to be interested.
Target audience.
Yeah. Target audience. That's true. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Nick, do you want to say a couple things about yourself before we dig in?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you all for having me on here. I just commend you on spending the time that you have with this text, and also your listeners for spending it with you. I mean, it's a lot, And but so a bit about me. My name's Nick Smaligo. My background is in philosophy, and so I kind of just in general am involved in this much longer project of trying to read Graeber and to think about his as a political philosopher who used anthropology and ethnography as a kind of methodology, as a necessary methodology to do an actually universal theory of human political possibilities. And I can say a bit more about kind of the arc of my engagement with him. But I guess I'll also say that I a long time ago, I wrote a book about the Occupy movement that really used a lot of Graeber's thought. And I have an enduring interest in it. And that piece about Dawn of Everything and Walter Benjamin, it was partly because, Walter Benjamin and the Theses on Philosophy of History have always spoke to me and always been really enigmatic. And that's part of their appeal and the appeal of all of Benjamin's writing. It's just what does this mean,
Right. Yeah.
For sure.
And so part of the exercise for myself about that was to really try to pin down an interpretation of the theses, and to then say, how does this what I hope is a very plausible reading relate with what they're doing? Because I sensed all these resonances there, and it was also an attempt to speak to the broader kind of critical left to say that what Graeber is doing actually operates on these levels too. It's not just this popular thing.
Right.
And, a lot of people have really liked that essay. I also really welcome critical feedback, and I'm sure that there's elements of Benjamin's thought that I am, blowing past there too. So I really hope and still enjoy having critical conversations about it too.
So does your interest in Graeber predate the Occupy movement? How long have you been reading his work?
I'm pretty sure that I actually only read Graeber for the first time during Occupy. It's possible that I had encountered him before, but during Occupy, he was one of the most accessible and vocal and public kind of articulators of a certain aspect of Occupy, which was like the anarchist aspect of it. And I found that really, really helpful. And really, Occupy, just to be honest, for me was this kind of life-changing event, as it was for a lot of people that were like thrust into it at the time. And it was this moment of kind of seeing this whole history of radical struggle that had been accumulating all of these practices and experiments, and realizing, oh yeah, I've actually been engaged in parts of that on some level. I just didn't see it for what it was,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's a really fascinating aspect of a lot of social movements like that, where they kind of rewrite your own experience of how these ideas have moved through your life.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I read a lot of Graeber and a lot of other folks too, and he figured very heavily in my kind of like, so I wrote the book that I wrote was really me kind of just going through that personally and being like, what is the history that made this thing possible? In addition to kind of analyzing some of its dynamics and stuff. And so I just relied very heavily on him there. And also after Occupy, really was kind of done with Graeber's thought for a while, and was much more into and really embraced a lot of the heavy critiques of Occupy from the left and ultra left, the critique of direct democracy, consensus process, things, and kind of felt like, and I think a lot of my friends and comrades and others, felt similarly that well, we know what Graeber's doing. It's a little kind of weak, or it's a little soft, and we're trying to kind of carve out some other thing. And it wasn't until 2018 when he published On Kings with Marshall Stallings that I was like, oh, I'll just check in, see what Graeber's up to here. And I read by page 2, I was like, who is this person? What on earth are you this seems totally different to me. And I mean, I can get into that specifically, but it got me thinking that, well, maybe I don't understand what he's up to. And then I think in some ways, again, thinking about the dawn of everything, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but something about this text has to be read in light of that experience of Occupy, that there's a kind of self-critique or a moving past a certain framework that had been kind of co-opted already in the decade between Occupy and this coming out. And this really gets into this question of egalitarianism, and which is one of I think the hardest kind of the hardest bone to chew about this text. It's hard to wrap your head around why there would be a polemic against egalitarianism in a book like this.
Yeah, true.
but it makes a lot of sense when you look at it from the perspective of, well, okay, the Occupy movement was in some way defanged by its message just being about inequality writ large, and then asking, well, what was motivating the people like Graeber among them, who were organizing these occupations that dropped out when it just became about inequality, that we can have a think tank about that's kind of studying the measure of wealth in the abstract, and what dropped out was autonomy, was freedom, was the ability to create our lives together.
Yeah.
What I love about all of what you just said is that there's a way that your individual experience, which is also the experience of so many people who are part of the different occupations that happened, there's a way that what you experienced when we're in movement, we see this where you start to his naming of things and other thinkers like Graeber's naming of things and processes helps you reorient your own life in a way. And what's interesting to me, and to see your own history in those like radical terms. But what's cool is that, and I hadn't really thought about, was that the project of the Dawn of Everything is kind of doing the same thing, but for history writ large, for humans, for the species, you know? And so like they're going through and naming these processes that we all know have happened, but they're like naming them and pointing to them and saying like, this is part of the liberatory struggle that's always there. So while you see it for yourself, and they help a lot of people do that, and so do other thinkers, of course, they're not the only people that are doing that. But yeah, they're helping people collectively do that for humans, you know, which is really interesting. And I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah, I think that just the practice of naming, you know, it gets actually to this like, you know, kind of deep feature of what I would say is Graeber's kind of orientation towards social science, and specifically the attempt to develop a social science for human liberation. Mm-hmm. That, you know, it involves being always ready to kind of reorient the categories, reorient the perspectives that you have, to introduce new categories. And then this is the really weird part, which I didn't know if I was going to say, but here we are right at the beginning, is the strange proximity between that and magic.
Oh yeah, 100%.
That there's within social science, this uncomfortable kind of analogy with a magical practice that is actually like trying to create new possibilities through the use of language too.
For sure.
You know?
Yeah.
And there are some, I mean, just to run with this magic thing briefly, like there are some theories of magic, this is making me think, that assert that the key thing about a magical working is like a reorientation or orientation in the consciousness of the person who's working the magic. Now, that's not the only theory that's out there.
Right.
But that is definitely the kind of thing that Graeber's writing is always trying to do.
Yeah. It's a reorient, like like acknowledging the confines of the concepts and the frameworks and the way that they limit our capacity. And then to actually like shift to sort of like blow up those structures in the mind so that they can be renamed. I mean, and you're right, it's absolutely part of like so many different magical traditions, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's cool.
And so when Graeber's like, you know, if you're doing carpentry with a friend and you like loan a guy a hammer, like you're doing communism. That's communism.
Right.
you know, you're doing it already. And that's part of the magic, I think, right?
Yeah. And so, yeah, exactly. And that's like this scandalous attempt to like reappropriate and reframe the meaning of communism. And it's actually it's central to his project, right? This concept of baseline or everyday communism really figures in, I think, to his conception of how you know, and maybe we'll talk about, right, how we get unstuck.
Right.
But also, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people hate it, but he's trying to lure you into a different perspective. And what I guess I'll just say, it's like it's both. And he talks about this as early as his dissertation, which, you know, was published later as Lost People, and it is it involves a theory of magic that also recognizes its proximity to actually what social science for liberation would be. I don't know. I can very easily get ahead of myself here. So,
well, I think that's a good start. And I am excited to even have those things to be stewing on while we're moving through some of the other conversation, because it's exciting. And also what I find partially exciting about it is, you know, Graeber and some other folks like that can sometimes come across as like, not dismissive of magic, but heavily invested in like the process of reason and the rational subject, you know. And so to see this like magical undercurrent, that the work that he's at is actually working on that level, on that frequency, whether or not he is even conscious of that. And you think he probably is in some way.
I think absolutely.
It's fascinating to me, you know.
Yeah. And I'll also say, just on that point, because yes, like Graeber is committed to a realist conception of science,
right,
the power and possibility of human thinking, more primarily than reason, though, he's committed to the imagination as, you know, what is fundamentally, you know, our human capacity and both our only hope and the site at which we become really constrained. And I think it's very easy to, there were definitely people that read The Dawn of Everything and, read this emphasis on freedom and the comments about individualism at different times as like, oh, they're projecting a certain kind of enlightenment subject backward. And I just think that it can certainly read that way, but that is not his philosophy of the human being. I mean, he believes human beings are fundamentally relational. We are always in this process of co-creating ourselves. Freedom, fundamentally for him, right, is the ability for us to make promises to each other, which is also always a limitation on our individuality. But he's not doing this very common gesture of fully rejecting the Enlightenment tradition. Right. He's actually engaged in, along with many other people, this process of trying to decolonize the Enlightenment, to situate the Enlightenment within a much wider interaction of encounter across many continents. And here we're seeing highlighted this North American encounter. But then if you look at the Pirate Enlightenment book, then he's talking about, the encounter with Malagasy pirates and stuff, so there's a lot going on, which is ultimately why it's so obsessive for me, because it's actually a challenge to piece together what this guy's thought really was in all of its kind of scope and grandeur,
I'm really glad you addressed that Enlightenment part, because, I mean, I even have some notes around that were possible topics for this conversation. And I don't want to take us there like right now, but it's something that's come up in our conversations about the book through the chapters too, is like, to what extent is Graeber holding on to this kind of like Enlightenment ideal of, rational deliberation being like the primary mode of human creation and co-creation, and The Dawn of Everything seems to want to like assert the value of that and then like justify it by kind of bringing it back in through like Candy-a-Ronk. And like I have complicated thoughts around it. Like, is this really what he's doing? And also like really just, I mean, what The Dawn of Everything helps to do is to show us that you don't have to take all of the Enlightenment as a single package.
Right.
And also, to show us that, like, no, it did not arise out of the minds of these specific people at this specific time in European history. Right. Yeah. But I guess to maybe engage with The Dawn of Everything more directly, you brought up the project of the book is like to help us get unstuck, right? And so let's talk about that a little bit, because that is definitely a refrain throughout the book, is that even though popular conceptions of human history and freedom and the loss of that are wrong in a lot of ways, we surely do seem to be stuck in undesirable ways of living. And there's this question of like, how did we get stuck? Then, of course, the corollary question, which is, how might we get unstuck? What do you think of the framing of this? How do we get stuck? And how do you think that the book like helps us get toward understanding that?
Yeah, right to the core of things. So the first thing I want to say about this like framing stuck, I mean, the way that I read it as it's a shift in perspective, right? It's like, imagine that you're talking to a friend who's just had like a terrible tragedy happen, or they're deeply depressed, or or like their life doesn't seem possible, and you're in this horrible situation, and it feels like you're condemned and you are in hell and everything is exactly how it has to be, and it's just like there's no way out, right? And you could imagine like a kind of therapeutic approach to that, being like you're acknowledging it's bad, but it's we're just stuck. It's not over. It's not fate. It's a moment of stuckness, right? So I think one thing about like rhetorically, right, this is the level that the book is operating on, trying to say like, okay, when we're stuck, we need to find different perspectives and maybe make and gain different tools, expand our horizons a bit. But what we're rejecting is the notion of determinism and full on chains here. The second moment, right? And you alluded to this earlier, Janet, about kind of blowing up the walls of the imagination, right? I mean, this is the terrain that Graeber is really operating on throughout his whole kind of writing career. And that is to say, Graeber believes that what we believe is possible makes a big difference in terms of how we act, and therefore what becomes possible, right? And that's the centrality of what he'll at some point call the immanent imagination. The imagination is actually structuring our sense of what we have capacity to do in the world. And so, and this is partly how, you know, the rhetorical form of many of his works, right, are just like these dynamite charges on the borders of the imagination. I mean, this is what in Debt, in the first, second chapter about the barter myth, right? He's locating where the myth is that is actually building a barrier around our ability to imagine what actually happened in the world, right?
Yeah.
And then also to see those thousands of different human forms of, in this case, gift economies that are actually a part of the historical record, but we have all of these ways that we make them appear as irrelevant to us, right? And that's part of the limitation of the imagination. So that's also what's going on here. That's what they're trying to do with the indigenous critique, right? And ultimately with their kind of historical genesis of the framework of egalitarianism and original egalitarianism, to locate this thing that appears to be a kind of foundational structure of leftist thinking even, right? But that they're saying actually serves as this imaginary barrier that prevents us from taking seriously the forms of life of people around the world that have been erased or put into this kind of prehistoric category of human existence. So this is what being unstuck means, right? Being unstuck in this case means expanding the immanent political imagination, which is not the same thing as, preventing the police from beating us up should our imaginations expand too far, right? I mean, there's all of these questions about, well, okay, but he thinks it's a necessary, not a sufficient cause or sufficient condition for transformational, revolutionary, building a inhabitable world to expand and break those floodgates of the imagination. So that's what his kind of task is. So now concretely on the book, right, what's their answer to this question? And a number of commentators, reviewers, there's so many really bad reviews of this book that you have to acknowledge that, well, okay, there must have been some shortcoming in the articulation here.
Right. Yeah.
Is one possibility. The other possibility, though, is that this is a book that is going to make perfect sense in 10 years.
Yeah.
Really? And I think that's also entirely possible, right? Is that it is just a book that is like just over the edge, and through its reading, it's going to transform common sense in a certain way, and it'll just be like, it will retroactively make sense to more people. One can hope. But I'll just say then, I think they do provide a tentative answer to this question of how we got stuck and of what the basic kind of form of human social forms that gets people stuck is. And that is essentially, to put it in one sentence, it is the entanglement of care and domination.
Right.
Right. This is the core kind of theme around which they are trying to reorient history and reorient our own understanding of ourselves.
Yeah.
And that is the introduction of relations of domination into the most intimate spheres of social reproduction of the home life. And they're saying, like, when this happens, that becomes this thing that really incapacitates or really limits people's imaginations of social possibilities. And this thesis like really resonates with stuff going on all through Graeber's work, his engagement with Marcel Mauss in particular. But it also is like incredibly politically timely. And, they don't put a fine point on many things, including, the struggle over women's reproductive rights, right? But we are in real time seeing the way in which fascist politicians seem, for some weird reason, to take it as a priority to reorganize the home life, reorganize the most intimate spheres of our lives. And we could say, well, why is that? And one way to read, or one of the kind of things coming out of this text is something that really should make it clear that the political stakes of this are very high, right? They are trying to assert sovereign control over the spaces in which human beings are fundamentally created, right? Which means where they get a sense of what the possibilities for life really are. And so that I'll pause for a moment, but I think that this is, a point that is maybe too subtly made, but I think it's absolutely central, and it kind of coheres with, or as the wider theory that they're introducing around forms of freedom and systems of domination and other things.
I think that entanglement that you're talking about is, of course, so interesting. And it's interesting in a lot of ways because there are a lot of people who theorize that male domination is like really core to the way things can go in certain directions that can be kind of hard to get unstuck from.
Yeah.
Because when they get baked in at that like family level and then scaled up, which, they do detail there, it can be, I guess it can seem more challenging to reimagine in a way when care is central there, when care is central, then it's like the intimacy of that sort of makes it more invasive in our conception of what's possible or something.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why, in the conclusion they bring up, and it's weird. It's a weird paragraph because it kind of feels like, how do you like, it feels like a non sequitur where they're talking about technology and innovation, and they're talking about these kind of zones of ritual play where different tools can be, are used or experimented with, but don't like rewrite all of social existence, right? But they can be there as a kind of reservoir of different possibilities. And then they're like, I wonder if they're like, here's a question that we think would be, an interesting one. It's like, is there a correlation between women's freedom and innovation socially? And you're like, where did that come from?
Yeah.
But like the logic of it is like, well, when you have societies that recognize women's autonomy, right, you're creating a limit on whatever kind of sovereign power might assert elsewhere, or the domination of, whatever public social form you happen to have. It can't extend into the sphere that women are in control of. And so you already have now a multiplicity of different power structures in a given society. And so so what they're just offering this as a question, like, does that actually generate social creativity or technical creativity? And I think they just pose it as a question. And I think that's also one of the things about this conclusion, right? Is everything, because what they're trying to do is, as they say, right, to offer better questions, but also to lay the foundations for what they call a new science of history. Their point is to initiate this kind of perspectival shift, lay out some basic categories that could allow for different kinds of questions to be asked, and then try to point us in the direction of empirical and theoretical research. They're not trying to provide definitive answers. They're saying this is what it might be like, and this is generated from a perspective different from what most of our social science has started from,
Yeah. And in that way of generating questions, it's like, for me to contemplate their thesis about care relations, it just unleashes so
A lot.
Many of them, and this is where my brain being prone to like the granularity, where I'm asking like, okay, so they're not saying that all relations of domination originate in care relations necessarily, but they're saying that the answer to how we got stuck is in when they become related. And then I also have questions about like, since relations of people who live close inside families and tight groups of kin or just tight groups of friends are how we live in general, is it possible for relations of domination to originate not in that context too?
Yeah. And I can't really answer the question, but I think this is the point though, right? Is like
Yeah.
let's try to understand this rather than being like, well, there's private life over there, right? And private life is kind of just, you can be a specialist in the history of domestic life or something like that, or you can be a feminist and care about these things, but that's not doing big history, big politics or something, right? And so they're blowing up that wall between public and private. And they do suggest that there are certain kinds of patterns, right? One kind of pattern, like partly what they're saying is that, when you have this kind of external warlike society, one of the things that it can do, and it's not necessary, but is, the reorganization of the household in order to create people on that social model. Contemporary aside, one of the things that's like been shocking for me thinking about, Donald Trump as having been the president is, it's just like, man, how many young kids grew up, how many young boys like me, like if I was a little kid and Donald Trump was the president, like grow up with that as a model of what, and a moral exemplar is for human life.
Right.
Or how many, parents look at that and say, that's what success is. Great. That's the kind of thing I'm going to, applaud in my child. Right. And so stepping back, right. And this is just a kind of core point about Graeber's whole thought, which feeds into this. And it's actually, is that Graeber really is convinced by the kind of Marxist, feminist, autonomist theorists. He just agrees.
Yeah.
And the way that he puts it is, but he goes further than some of those folks, not all of them, to say like, it's not even about social reproduction. He's say like the process of creating human beings, not only young babies, but each of us in our process of mutual self-creation. This is the primary form of labor in human life. It is not commodity labor. And this is the kind of error of a certain Marxist analysis that takes its model of labor as the production of things.
Yeah.
Whereas for the broad scope of human history, the primary thing that you're doing is producing people. You're producing each other, and you produce things in the service of that, or then there's the whole fun exploration of fetishism in his work too.
Yeah.
But this is kind of, the analysis of the dawn of everything is drawing this out, right? We're producing each other. That requires spaces of care, which can be the care for our freedoms, the creation of people who are capacious to exercise these basic freedoms, including most centrally the freedom to remake who they are, to remake social relations, to create new human peoples, right?
Yeah.
That third freedom. And so the question of how we got stuck is, how did we lose the ability to imagine ourselves as capable of creating new peoples, of no longer being who we are, but becoming different, right? And this is where, the introduction of domination, of relations, of violence and threats and violence into the most intimate spheres where we usually, or in contexts where domination or violence and care are separated, that's where we experience communism. That's where we experience the free complexity of human interrelations, right? But stupidifying that with violence, really limits people's imaginative capacities.
Well, oh wait, you have something to say right now?
You go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is, as I've been contemplating the book as a whole, and I'm reflecting on it again as through what you were talking about, especially after rereading your piece on Closing Paradise's Gates, actually, is that there's a way, and I think Benjamin is pointing to this in his work, that like it can feel like while the Davids are kind of like rolling out these freedoms for us and being like, this is what makes people free. This is what we've always known as made people free. We just don't name it. That's a limitation. We're going to name it. If you're looking at the history of control and domination, it's as if the various powers of domination throughout time had a pretty good idea of what made people free and how to curtail it and kept coming up with ways to stop it. And I was thinking about Federici's book, the Caliban book, and that, you know, when you read about the transition, the creation of capitalism, that, you know, they're like, all right, so we're going to make it illegal to travel. Vagrancy will be illegal. It'll be illegal to be poor.
Yeah.
It'll be illegal, you know, like, and you have to make your work in the home in addition to at the mill, or like whatever the different things are, where it's just like having a good idea. The point being partially like it's as if hierarchical powers like have a pretty good idea of which freedoms need to be curtailed so people can't remake society, you know, and have planned around that for a long time, maybe without even consciously making those decisions, except to just be like putting out fires here and there.
Yeah.
But collectively, it can have the feeling of intelligence and inevitability. And then I think part of what the Davids are doing is like it's attempting to like be like, no, we need to name the freedoms so we can reclaim them and understand them.
Yeah.
Instead of only seeing what we don't have.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, just to piggyback on that, like really quick, I mean, I think that what you're pointing to is important because it also brings to light one of the major things that I think is happening throughout this book and that I've been reflecting on a lot here at the end is just that like a big part of the project seems to be just reorienting the way we tell the stories, right? Because, you know, the way that you were just talking about, like the powers of domination know what limits our freedoms and works to curtail those things. It seems like the Davids and Graeber in general, like they don't like to tell the story of the agency and the power of the dominators. Right. That's not where they want to locate the stories that they're telling as much. You know, and one of the things that Nick does in his essay that I really liked at the end was like talk about how the dawn of everything kind of like reinvents Benjamin's notion of the tradition of the oppressed, that long tradition of like solidarity through time of the people who are like always revolting and resisting against our domination, you know, this history that we draw on and wanting to kind of speak instead about the tradition of the free, like the tradition of the people who know what freedom is and know how to be free. And Graeber always likes to point out how we still kind of know how to be free. Yeah. And we will exercise it as much as we can. Like we don't even really need to be taught exactly. And so how we got stuck is a way of talking about how we got in a tough spot with our freedoms instead of the story about how the dominators like grew to be better and better at dominating us. Yeah. And that kind of reversal is key, it seems like, to what the book is trying to present to us always.
Yeah. That's how I read it, you know, that it's like this aspect switch, right? That what looks like a tradition of the oppressed and which is from within the regime of domination is actually like a front line to an outside that, you know, is a much richer history that we have had a hard time seeing because there's not the archives there. You know, this is like a problem. I remember being at a seminar where we were talking about Maroon histories and they're like, well, how do you tell a story about a society that you know was there, but you also know that the only people that wrote anything down were actively hostile to it in every way, right? You know, or you have traces that another place was there, but they actually like deliberately just tried to erase it from the record, you know? And so this is one of the things that is kind of methodologically interesting throughout Graeber's work, but where you know, it's like we know that the historical record is, you know, in Benjamin's sense, you know, it's written by the victors, right? And so then how do you create a history of what is, only detectable by traces, and part of the power of archaeology and Wenger's like really massive understanding of all of that is that is like the art of dealing with those indirect traces, right? And that the techniques of archaeology have improved so much that they have just tons more evidence now than we ever had,
Yeah.
But one of the things I want to say then, because you were talking about naming the freedoms and like the work that does in terms of like opening things up, or I don't remember your formulation, but I think it's a good place to say, like, I think the hardest part of this book but also the most enduring and significant, I hope, is that this is not just a critique of, various overt right-wing pro-domination perspectives. It's also a story of how the European left articulated itself as a project on a basis that shared the same false premises as the right-wing version, right? It's just as much of a critique of the histories of liberalism and many socialism,
right,
as it is a critique of the history that fascists and traditionalists of that sort draw on. And so this is where then, and what is really going on in the context of their polemic against Rousseau and the critique of egalitarianism as a framework, right? So they're trying to say that to put it in an analogy, and I'm assuming some of your listeners are familiar with what Debt did as a text.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the thing, though, is that a lot of people just like read the first or second chapter of Debt because it's just mind blowing. You're like, oh, barter didn't exist, and then you don't go on. That's fine. but there's a similar thing going on with the concept of egalitarianism here, right? It's an intellectual dynamite charge that's trying to locate a dam on the imagination, on the liberatory imagination, blow it open, and then let the complexity of reality flood in. And I know that when I first read they had like an essay before the book came out. I was like,
right.
Wait a minute, like there's no egalitarian societies, or that's one of their theses where they're like, there are no egalitarian human societies. It's like, how can you, like, that's not good. I don't know why y'all are so excited about this. Like, that was my reaction.
Yeah.
Graeber, you're the anthropologist of egalitarian societies. You're telling me there aren't any. I kind of have a lot at stake in this,
Right. Yeah.
And so this is why I think it's helpful to kind of try to work through just what a few different critiques of egalitarianism that they're putting forward in the book are, and their reconstruction of it, and what they're offering as an alternative perspective, which is, I think, a properly philosophical argument and theme that is spread out through the book, but isn't really laid out in a linear fashion, which we can kind of walk through. I mean, I'm not prepared with like texts or anything.
Right.
Sure.
I already kind of alluded to what I think was the political motivation in the present, right? And that is, Occupy, which makes this really massive dent in the cultural conversation in the US, other places too, it's received as, inequality is bad. And then that becomes a kind of like starting point for a bunch of people to be like, well, okay, what is equality? How do we measure it? How do we get it going? Right. And it becomes, as they allude to, like this kind of technocratic procedure.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's reason suddenly to be like, well, that's not quite what we were saying. We wanted, the abolition of the police. We wanted the abolition of nation states. We wanted all sorts of things. What did we really want? It wasn't just this, right? So one thing, right, is there is a conceptual ambiguity in the concept of equality, which they highlight. And equality can mean either everyone is the same in some way, or everyone is so uniquely different that there's no measure of comparison, right? And those are two actually like contradictory things, right? That is, there can be some common measure by which everybody is equal, or no common measure is possible, and thus everyone is equally not measurable.
Yeah.
And so that's just at a level of kind of high concept, that there's this kind of ambiguity in the concept of equality, which also leads to a lot of different kind of misunderstandings, right? Because on the one hand, right, what you might be actually talking about is we should all be free. Everyone is singular, right? But when it's framed in terms of equality, then you think, well, okay, what's the common measure? Who measures whether or not everybody is actually equal to that measure, right? And this is then the next thing, which is that the concept of equality, when it is relative to a common measure, property, possession, whatever, implies an overarching perspective that could evaluate whether or not people are equal or unequal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Does that make sense? That when I'm saying everyone should be equal relative to whatever set of values should be equal, I'm saying there needs to be then some overarching perspective that is the bearer of that gauge that can then say. And so this idea that claims or a social project premised upon creating equality implies a gaze that could really only be occupied by a sovereign or technocratic power. Graeber's not the first person to make this argument, and actually that argument is less made directly in the text, but it is elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody's really interested in this, I'm also obsessed with the work of Cedric Robinson, whose book The Terms of Order makes this argument in a really fascinating way, and really just prefigures a ton of Graeber's work. Cedric Robinson, the famous author of Black Marxism, the making of the Black radical tradition. Fascinating.
Cool.
Great. Yeah.
But so on this question of equality, so one, there's an ambiguity in the concept which continually leads to problems. Two, when it is so it implies a overarching kind of governing perspective in order to realize it. The next I'll say is that, and this is an argument that they make very explicitly, equality is kind of like a meta value, right? If you're going to say you like equality, you have to then specify what the values that you want to be equal are. And what they're saying is that we tend to focus on property relations, but that's kind of actually imposing a certain obsession with property and material wealth with that comes out of the European context or enlightened context.
Totally. Yeah. Right.
That is not actually how other societies, which we might say are completely egalitarian,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they don't conceive themselves as egalitarian because what's most important is a certain relationship with this or that sacred object.
Right.
Right. So there is this implicit, when we say equality and we mean property, right, we're actually sneaking in a certain kind of false universal value there.
Right.
Right. And so that's then a third element to their critique.
Yeah.
And then finally there's the historical critique, which is what is kind of front and center here, where they're trying to argue that what was a question that would be better interpreted in terms of freedom becomes a debate about equality through this reactionary process, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a lot to say about that. What I'll say is, I think that process that they're describing, it's a kind of colonial metaphysical move to, and it's in some ways like the deep structure of much of what becomes scientific racism and other things, right? That is the consignment of people in the present to a prehistorical past.
Yeah.
And so what they're saying is that, even for those people that are trying not to do the racist gesture of excluding people from the realm of human conversation, something about the framework of equality has effectively done that.
Mm-hmm.
Because what do we say? Well, they're an egalitarian society, and we have had this or that form of progress or regress, depending on how you look at it. But the whole point is none of that's relevant. We have to start over. right? And in some ways with Rousseau is, whether or not they're fair to Rousseau, and frankly, they're probably not. Nobody's fair to anybody. This is war, whatever, That's cynical, but there's some truth to that in terms of this process of like philosophical perspective shifting, right?
Yeah.
Is that, you it doesn't help you to get fully into the weeds of a thinker. What you're actually dealing with is not what the thinker thought, but what the political implications, what the mass meaning of it is, what the caricature that has shaped people's actual political sense of what's possible is. That's what you're dealing with. And so that's the level that their popular work is functioning on. And so, Rousseau, though, really does set the basic political theory of the entire left. I mean, there's a very famous among Marxists, Lucio Coletti is his name, who is an Italian Marxist who wrote a book, from Rousseau to Lenin. And he's just like, look, the whole political theory of the left is already in Rousseau. It doesn't substantially change. Marx and Engels add an economic component. That's really cool.
Wow.
Right. But, and every, the people that say this, they're like, well, it's overstated, but it's kind of right, and there's a recent scholar, a guy named Peter Hallward, who's a really like sophisticated and thoughtful philosopher and historian of European philosophy and Marxist. And he is just like, yeah, that's right. Rousseau's got it all. Here's what it is. Right. And so like, it is a really serious thing then to understand what they're doing at the level of political theory here. Right? Because what they are trying to do is to articulate, and they're not even saying it outright, right? They're trying to lay the groundwork for a philosophy of history that allows for a liberatory political theory that is outside of the wake of the left as we know it. And that's not entirely novel, because what they're saying is actually what we need is an understanding of history that allows us to listen to the variety of indigenous sources, the variety of people who have been trying to hold on to their own traditions of freedom and have been saying we have something universal to contribute. This is not our private property of our identity or ethnic group. These are universal techniques of relating to the earth, of relating to one another, of building a world that are being systematically taken out of the conversation because, quote unquote, we can't go back to those times,
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great articulation of like the stakes of, what they're doing with egalitarianism in the book. And I definitely want to get back to that because it relates to kind of a big question I have really directly. Also, I just want to, there was one little quibble that I always had with their definition of this is what equality, like it's either this or that. And it always seemed like there was just another possibility that equality is about having an equal say.
Yeah.
Having like a equal say in common affairs, which is like not a really far out of left field definition of equality, but it's one that they never really consider as one of the possible metrics, in the book. And I don't know. It was just kind of an unanswered question. I was like, this seems like an obvious thing.
I think it's like this, Graeber spent the vast majority of his life considering himself an egalitarian, right? That's the project. The project is egalitarian decision-making, consensus. Everyone has an equal say, right? Yeah. So it's like, yes, you can put what you are trying to get into that concept.
Right.
You can do it. The question is whether or not by trying to break it out of that concept, you can see other things too.
Yeah.
And run and get away from all the ambiguities that traps you in.
Sure.
Right.
And it still kind of implies a referee of some type.
Yeah. And it's like, there's material equality and formal equality, right? All of these dialectics that are kind of based on trying to force a bunch of different values into this one concept. So what they're trying to say is shift in perspective, time, right? And that also has tremendous consequences in terms of how we think about social forms and organizing and other things, and might even be more realistic for us.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing, right? And you've been in spaces where everybody's trying to have equal say, and you're like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean everyone speaks for the same amount of time? Some people speak better than others. Other people have more information. Some people, it's like, it actually becomes this thing where then it actually lures a lot of very resentful affects, right? If somebody doesn't like the decision for some other reason, maybe they're scared or whatever, they won't just say that. They'll say, I didn't have the ability, the equal time, or there's some, right? So we're trying to, and these are, of course, the problems of Occupy, among many other things.
Yeah.
So what's another perspective on this? Well, when we shift to talking in terms of concrete freedoms, right? And that also, it's like, that is this massive abstraction, right? They're not saying that there's ever been a society that has been like, okay, here are our 3 basic principles, right? Anybody can leave, anybody can disobey, anybody can, or we remake it, right, every spring. But here's the thing, and I'm going to get a bit into Graeber's philosophy of social science, the influence of Roy Bhaskar, who's his kind of favorite philosopher, who's always saying, science is what he calls a retroductive process. It's always looking for the conditions of the possibility of something. Right, we're asking scientific questions. We're like, this is an event. What makes it possible? Now, Graeber, you could say that part of what this text is doing is saying, hey, we have an ethnographic record with thousands of different human societies, right, where people have fundamentally different ideas about what is valuable. How is it possible that all of that happened? How did people come to speak different languages? How did people come to populate the earth and have so many different systems of what it means to be human? What are the conditions for the possibility of creating new peoples, of ethnogenesis, right?
Right.
And maybe that's the sense, that's another way to frame our question of stuckness, right? Here we are thinking of ourselves in all of these terms that are imposed on us by regimes of domination, and we don't even know how to conceive ourselves as like becoming new people.
Yeah.
So what are the conditions that allow for the creation of new peoples? And these 3 freedoms, right? That's it. And then what you get then is this theory then is like, oh, actually, one way to conceive the variety of different human peoples on the earth is that they were successful revolutionary projects. They came from somewhere. They broke off of somebody, right? And it became a different thing.
Yeah.
So these 3 freedoms that are thinking bare bones, and there might be more ways you could do it. You could develop the theory, right? But bare bones, popular work that is also trying to offer a new philosophy of history, right? These 3 things, right? The freedom to leave, the freedom to disobey, the freedom to remake your social world. One thing that is then interesting, right, is and I don't remember who I heard this from, but many of the ways that those were actually framed for different peoples was not in terms of freedoms, but in terms of kinship obligations.
Yeah.
Obligations of hospitality.
Right.
I was just reading Graeber's essay about Palestine. So he went there in 2015, and he was saying, we just have to understand that, like, the substance of Palestinian life is hospitality. And one of the most important things about being a Palestinian is being able to offer and make gestures of hospitality to people. And Israel's just the worst possible guest. It was part of this point. So when we're thinking about these freedoms, I think we have to think about them as the ability to remake who we are, and the ability to, and that involves making new kinds of kinship relations, right? Where we're thinking of kinship not in terms of nuclear families, but in terms of establishing a mutuality of being among people. When we put egalitarianism aside and focus on these conditions of freedom, what that allows for is a free relationship with different political forms. the best way that I have to articulate this actually comes from the end of Bullshit Jobs, where Graeber is talking about the BDSM theory of social liberation. And it's like this, okay? When people, just think about it like this. When people practice BDSM, right, what you do is you create a context of trust and consent.
Mm-hmm.
And what do people do with that context of trust and consent? Well, sometimes it's about having, what could be called an egalitarian relationship, but lots of times it is about playing with domination. It's about playing with hierarchy in 1,000 different ways, right? Because, well, another example, the theater, right? The concept of theater and theatrical kings and theatrical forms kind of runs through this. Think about what happens in the theater. We go as an audience member and we completely do not demand an egalitarian relationship with the people on stage, right? We submit, we shut ourselves up because there is something interesting in allowing yourself to be receptive to that, because there's something you want to see, something you want to play. It is meaningful and fascinating to watch people be awful to each other sometimes, right? This is the human experience here. And when we're saying that, egalitarianism is what we want, is it really what we want? Or do we want the freedom to have whatever experiences we need to have, but also to know that if suddenly there were like armed guards locking the entrance to the theater, right, that would be a different situation.
Yeah.
Now we'd be in a state.
Right.
Right? Because you can't leave the drama, right? The drama is no longer in this kind of suspended situation of play, right? Where you can leave, it's going to end. If anybody tells you to do something, you say, hey, I'm an audience member, man, fuck off, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But so there's this way in which what we're talking about here, or the theory that they're giving us, is saying actually much of the evidence that we have for kings and these kind of things that look like systems of domination sometimes might have been much more like long-form theatrical situations, because people could have moved away and they were there because actually kings are pretty interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for all of that. That's really great. And it's really a huge answer to this question that we've been wondering. I don't know, since the beginning of the book, but definitely after. And that's like, it's something that you alluded to, which is, what does the Dawn of Everything offer to the left? Like, offer to the revolutionaries, the anarchists, the leftists of the world, right? Because there is like a surface level on which the book seems to be like, I don't know, trying to convince the masses more broadly that we can have a better world, and that more freedom is not just lost to us because we're in a different stage of evolution of society or something like that. But then, to be the kind of people that we are, well, we don't need to be convinced of that. We already at least believe that we see a path forward and we can imagine or have faith. Maybe it's just faith. I don't know. But yeah, so like, what does the book do, for us, quote unquote? Because I think it does a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the big things it does is this reframing away from egalitarianism and equality. I think that's one of the big things.
And then at the same time, right, it's saying, okay, we're talking about 3 concrete freedoms. We're not talking about rights, right? Mm-hmm. Because rights are things, at least in most formulations of them, they're granted by the state.
Right.
So they already take for granted that you are kind of territorially bound within the state's like dominion there. So that's really important, right? And we're not talking, so we're not talking about things that are kind of nominally granted. We're talking about positive relations that are built up that make these freedoms real. And so that's one thing, right? Is an emphasis on not trying to which is a classic kind of anarchist approach, right? That we're trying to build the relationships that make the new world possible, outside of the reach of those in power or something. We're not trying to have them granted and codified or whatever, because that's ultimately on those terms. So for me, like, there was like a kind of moment of clicking, of thinking about these freedoms, where I realized, like, oh, it's kind of like what I see people already doing in a certain way, right? People make relationships among organizers in different places. They travel from one city to another. They move around, right? And just in building those networks, they're building a kind of kinship network that allows for the exercise of concrete freedoms, which we feel as a sense of empowerment and improvement in our lives, or when there's a campaign here, the ability to draw on, work, research, people coming in, to help people disobey, and to create kind of, gatherings. We all met at a gathering a few years ago, right? Where people are enacting different relationships with one another. We're camping together. We're cooking together. We're living this kind of everyday communism.
Yeah.
So rather than thinking of those things as something that is like, a nice vacation from the real work of political engagement or something like that, what if we say, actually, what we're doing is kind of building, we're exercising our muscles. We're entering this long tradition of how people have gotten free. We're building social possibilities at the margins that can become more efficacious in our lives in other situations, right? And what would it look like to really lean into those things and say, this is actually the content of our organizing, right? What we're doing is building relationships across these places. What we're doing is trying to directly empower and invite more and more people into the experience of freedom that many people, as quote unquote radicals, have already experienced, right? That's a totally different kind of shift in our direction of organizing, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one. I think it's ambiguous. You could take it in a lot of different directions, but that's one thing that seems pretty interesting to me. And how does that, change people's, and hopefully encourage people's ability to stand up for themselves wherever they are against whatever bullies are trying to dominate them, knowing that you have a network of other people that can support you, So that's one thing. The other thing is, like we were talking about earlier, is that, the stakes and the nature of kind of actual household relations, of actually how we live our lives and reproduce them, are not politically irrelevant, right? This is actually a front line in the struggle of possibilities for the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so breaking down that dichotomy between public political activity and private, who knows or who cares what you do, is another thing that I think is an important kind of direction this goes in.
Yeah. I also think that, like, something that you alluded to earlier, which is just kind of opening the receptivity to like more examples from the ethnographic record, from history. There can be a tendency, I've participated in this, to like maybe dismiss the inspiration that could maybe be obtained from studying other cultures by judging them as being like insufficiently egalitarian or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the insights in this book kind of question that knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah,
for one thing.
Totally. Just to bring back these kind of theatrical king and queen things, like in Southern Illinois, there's this weird thing called the Tomato Festival, which, it involves, they like elect a tomato king and queen every year, and it happens kind of secretive, and it's like, everybody goes around the fire with instruments shouting tomato and stuff like that. but it is this really weird thing where you're like, oh, this isn't monarchy. This isn't like terrible that we do this weird thing and let a tomato king and queen exist, and they pick the next tomato king and queen, or all the old ones do. It's like
right.
There's just something like fun about it, and even being bossed around and told to do silly things by the tomato queen, should she want to exercise her power, So I think also it's like it can lead to this kind of loosening up, where it's like, well, okay, if we are actually creating these contexts in which everybody knows that if they don't like what's going on in this social center, that thing there, right? There's another one. They can go somewhere else. And then to say like, okay, within that context where we trust that we actually have those freedoms, right? Maybe we're less immediately worried about the microdynamics of all of them and always looking for, what's wrong or what's not sufficiently egalitarian here, something like that. It's like, okay, that's this thing, and this thing, we'll make sure that there's times when we can change it, disrupt it, but also this isn't the same thing as exercising the sovereign power of violence over me, right? This isn't the same thing as, and so I think it can lead to this kind of loosening up of some of the ways in which we tend to say, like with this kind of prefigurative model that like, well, okay, we're trying to create the relationships that are we want to see projected on the world at large. Therefore, the stakes are so high. And if anybody is, in any way insufficiently whatever version of egalitarian we're working with, then they need to be expelled or something like that, right? It can allow for a bit more of a forgiving relationship and even a fun relationship with people's personalities,
Right. Yeah, provided that we're mindful of the basic freedoms.
The basic freedoms, yeah. And that doesn't mean, and I'm even inclined to like take back what I said, because it's like, I'm not trying to minimize the problems of racism or the problem of sexism, in these spaces, and the subtle ways that stuff like that can reproduce itself.
Yeah.
I do think that one approach to that, though, might be to be like, well, let's make sure we can exercise the third freedom. Let's have, whoever's speaking loudest, like, you're shutting up for this month, and we're doing something totally different, seeing how it goes, right? Mm-hmm. It like to invite experimentation,
Yeah.
and to say like, okay, we're not ever making the rules for all time, right? We're only ever living as an experiment. And and we understand that it's going to, whatever we do is going to change.
Yeah. One thing that the Davids are really good about pointing out too is the difference between formal and real freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
Like the capitalist system that we live under is really good at simulating a certain kind of freedom, where it's like, if you don't like your job, you can quit your job.
Yeah.
Right? But
you can work from anywhere.
Yeah.
But really, though, do we have the freedom to do something else? Like it has to really exist in the conditions that are pertaining, and not just in, like an idealistic sense.
Yeah.
But I think that they're really good on that and pointing that out.
Yeah. And that's a huge project for all of us, right? What does it take to build a context of these freedoms? How would they exist for us today?
Yeah. You had something new.
Yeah. I was just going to say that this is all reminding me also of a couple episodes ago, we had a couple friends on Indigenous folks from Bulbacha, New Orleans, who built a mountain down there with a big group of people in the city. It's really cool. But also one of them is firmly lifetime in anarchist community, but also lifetime in Indigenous communities, the various kinds.
Yeah.
And something he said was that he was like, I just want to ask the listeners, people who are like more aligned in different like anarchist culture or other kinds of like movement culture, to have a more open mind when dealing with different indigenous folks and organizations and tribal structures. Not like the tribal council level that's actually like the colonial form, but he was referring to the way that people who are not part of these communities see hierarchy everywhere and see domination everywhere, when there is this actual like process that involves like elders having more say, and there being relations around experience and respect that outsiders, settlers, can't understand and want to project their own forms onto and name as hierarchical and not learn from.
Absolutely.
And so I see that here.
I mean, and what I would say, and it kind of, there's like a semantic choice you have to make, right? But I would say is that you could say, yes, those are hierarchical structures, but they're not dominance structures.
Right.
Right. That hierarchy can exist and does exist within a context of freedom, right? Which means, like, as I'm using theatrical examples, right? It's intrinsically interesting, but actually it could be deeply wise, And that's kind of it. This is the critique of egalitarianism once again, right? Is that the European articulation of anarchism, right? What was within this closure of the concept of egalitarianism as being what the ideology, what an anarchist is trying to do. And that blinds people from the actual substance of societies that have lived without states, which have involved forms of authority, right? But those forms of authority aren't the same things as sovereignty, aren't the same things as domination, right? And the reports from the ethnography are pretty clear, right? Like, chiefs had only their own words. They didn't have the power to coerce people, right? But you know what? You better listen to them, right? Like, you cannot. But these are the people that our community has decided are worth listening to,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate their point there. And I think it's something that I remember has really just been something that, like, one way to frame my whole interest in Graeber's project, actually. Because that is to say that there's been a contradiction within the concept of anarchism between its Enlightenment articulation and its indigenous resonance, right? That is anarchism as a revolutionary project that kind of envisions an insurrection that will then clear away authority and then will have something vague that is better, versus the study of actually existing or previously existing forms of human life that did not create states, but which then don't seem to have the kind of stress on individualism that the Europeans or conceive individualism in a very different way, right? Because there's often very robust forms of individualism, but there are forms of authority as well. There's this really, really interesting kind of Easter egg in this text, which I'm excited to share with you all. And it's it's about la hontan and this concept of anarchy. Because the normal story that we get, right, is that, anarchy, throughout much of the etymology just means like disorder and chaos or something, right? Or without principle, without arche.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not until Proudhon in the 19th century that this is kind of transmogrified into a positive political project and position. So, but what's really interesting is all you have to do is open up the Oxford English Dictionary and you will find two positive uses of the word anarchy before Proudhon. One of them is Mercator, who is talking about Swiss cantons, and the other is La Hontan, because in La Hontan's preface to one of the editions of his dialogue, he says, I could find the exact quote, but basically, he's on the run from all these princes of Europe, and he's like, basically, I think that none of us will be free until we live in an anarchy like the Wendat or like the Chiron.
Yeah.
And so here, right, this is a century before Proudhon, and he's got a positive political meaning of the word anarchy, but it's not some vague post-revolutionary vision. It's literally what they're doing, right? That's anarchy.
Yeah.
That is life without having to submit to anybody, right? And so it's really fascinating then. And you could imagine, I mean, I don't know why they chose to leave that out, right? but it's this funny thing. You could imagine Graeber and Wenger or whatever, right? Whoever, like, thinking about this and be like, huh, that's really fascinating. Like how did the concept of anarchy move from the concrete denotation of people who are living without kings and states to some utopian? And something about it is also then, right, that, well, the construction of the irrelevance of North American peoples to the political conversation. And this is something that, the French Enlightenment or the Enlightenment thinkers construct that imaginary wall there that we're breaking down.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Thanks for the Easter egg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe the publisher were like, we don't want the A word in the book.
It's possible,
I mean, it does seem like they're avoiding it, which is interesting.
They're also barely talking about democracy. I mean, I think partly, though, it's like they want to try to tell a story and try to address these questions without these words, right? Without these things that we think we know what they mean, right? Which actually kind of stop thought or gloss over all sorts of stuff. That's part of its power, though, too, right?
Yeah. Well, the last thing that I'll add to this list that we're making of stuff that the book can offer is something that I mentioned this to you, Nick, in an email that I'm still unpacking and I'm still going to be unpacking. But it has to do with this tendency that I know I have, and I think a lot of other people do as well, to like assume that relations of domination will ensue when certain conditions of their possibility are met. Right?
Yeah.
And like, I think what this amounts to is that it's maybe like an assumption that there's like a gravitational attraction written into the laws of human motion, towards relations of domination that are only by great effort warded off constantly, by people who would resist that. I realized this when we finished the book because they made a few examples right in the conclusion that really underscored this. And what it looks to me in my self-critique is like they're critiquing, and they're only do it implicitly. It's implicit, but it's almost a certain kind of intellectual laziness where you don't have to actually account for the power that power gets over people and how it gets there, because the assumption is just that it's going there unless there is resistance to stop it or the conditions are not right for it, And so, I mean, my example was when they're talking about the people who'd been taken into the temple in Sumeria, and the Davids are trying to account for, how their status got degraded and they became more exploited over time. And then, I'm like, well, they were refugees that were taken into a temple and they had people who were over them. And, I'm just like, well, this is the situation that's ripe for that. I mean, of course, like, why wouldn't it happen?
Right.
But the Davids seem to want to say, like, not so fast. Like, we actually have to talk about how that happened and not just assume it, And I mean, I think that's maybe too much for us to unpack all of that now, but I want to like say on tape before the season is over that was a big thing that dropped for me.
Yeah.
Right at the end of the book. And it feels like a fundamental, like, what would it mean to not make those assumptions?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of unpacking there.
Well, they do that so casually, it's so casual. They're just like, oh, we don't know why they did that. And I read it too and was like, what do you mean you don't know why power went that way? Like, that's what power does. Like, it just does that. And then you're like, oh, I'm doing the thing. I'm like, I'm assuming this.
I mean, I think that's just really well said. And I think that is exactly it, right? It's like that is a moment of being unstuck on a certain kind of thing that feels like logic, but is in fact deep habit and a contingent connection of the kind of society we have in which that does happen. Right?
Right.
If you're working without a union or, like whatever there's going to be.
Yeah.
And so, but, right, we what they're trying to say is that we can't generalize from that. Like there's a certain model of power operating here. That's not necessary. And then the question would be, right, it's like, what are the differences? And I think they're giving us some tools for thinking about that. Like, I don't think we need to even go further than the articulation that you have of it, that like,
yeah,
we're in the presence of an assumption there that's not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be harmful.
Yeah.
That
closes our ability to imagine other situations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or maybe to even see accurately what's right in front of us.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the other side of it, though, and this is the part, because what you're saying speaks to me too, is like, well, but also, like, none of us want to be naive about situations like that are actually happening on the ground here too, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And this is kind of the tightrope that I think Graeber really has to walk, and I think he's kind of chosen to lean on the side of naivete in a lot of his stuff, in order to really open up the sense of what's possible.
To keep it open, yeah.
Yeah, but his full project, I think, involves trying to actually, this is going to get real intense real quick, but to find a third perspective that incorporates both the Marxist perspective and what he'll call the Maussian perspective from Marcel Mauss.
Oh.
And he's saying both of these have their risks. Right. In Marx, right, you see the dynamics of the totality of power that kind of conditions every aspect of our lives. And that allows you to see real power relations or real relations of exploitation. But it can lead to this cynicism in the sense of, there's no possibility. We just have to wait for the proper conditions to emerge on their own or something like that. Like, we can't be free until the conditions are right.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, Mauss saw kind of every possible economic form as present within every human society.
Mm-hmm.
The gift economy didn't go away. There's all of these different social possibilities that are always active. And that's great because it allows us to see different possibilities. But the risk is that we end up just naive and we end up living in our kind of small scale fantasies and don't pay attention to the wider dynamics, right?
Right.
And so in order to understand Graeber's project as a whole, it's how do we cultivate a kind of third position that, incorporates both of these perspectives, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
That's great. And I think this might be maybe a decent place to leave it. Is there anything else that you want to say? I'm sure there's a million things that you want to...
This is great. It's so nice. I don't think anybody has ever given me the opportunity to just talk for 2 straight hours about this. These are conversations in my head. And so I feel really, really grateful for the opportunity to talk with you all about this. And I'm also, trying to write a book. So that would be cool. And maybe we'll give the opportunity for many more conversations. And it's been fun. It's really an adventure to try to figure out what this whole project has been.
Before you leave, is your book about like the totality of Graeber's work, or is it more just specifically about this text?
I'm trying to do the totality of Graeber's work because partly what's really interesting too is, he's in these debates about ontology. He's in these debates about the nature of social science.
Definitely.
He's got this, reworking of the concept of economics, of history, of value, and so what I just really want to do is to be able to lay out the scope and the power of the project, of his intellectual project, in a way that's clear and straightforward and can allow people, even if people are going to like criticize Graeber or disagree with them, to at least be like dealing with what his perspective is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because what's so frustrating is when people are like, oh, like I don't like Graeber because I like Marx, but aren't actually dealing with Graeber's own quite profound engagement with Marx.
Right.
And trying to wrestle with the theories he's putting forward, Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks in advance. I think that's really, you're doing the Lord's work. I think that's really needed. And that's part of why we wanted to have you on the show is like, let's have someone who can like help us understand like what's really being said here, because I am quite capable of getting sidetracked into
by the details.
By the details and kind of losing the thread.
Yeah.
But I think that we've kept to it here.
Yeah,
good.
I think so too.
Thanks.
Thank y'all so much.
When we see you.